Federalist Number 9, the Union as a Safeguard Against Domestic Faction and Insurrection, for The Independent Journal, Wednesday, November 21st, 1787. A firm union will be of the utmost moment of peace and liberty to the states, as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. It is impossible to read history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. If they exhibit occasional calms, these only serve as a short-lived contrast to the furious storms that are to succeed. If now and then intervals of felicity open to view, we behold them with a mixture of regret, arising from the reflection of the pleasing scenes before us, which are soon to be overwhelmed by the tempestuous waves of sedition and party rage. If momentary rays of glory break forth from the gloom, while they dazzle us with transient and fleeting brilliancy, they at the same time admonish us to lament that the vices of government should pervert the direction and tarnish the luster of those bright talents and exalted endowments, for which the favoured soils that produce them have been so justly celebrated. From the disorders that disfigure the annals of those republics, these advocates of despotism have drawn arguments, not only against the forms of republican government, but against the very principles of civil liberty. They have decried all free government as inconsistent with order of society, and have indulged themselves in malicious exultation over its friends and partisans. Happily for mankind, stupendous fabrics reared from the basis of liberty, which have flourished for ages, have, in few glorious instances, refuted their gloomy sophisms. And, I trust, America will be the broad and solid foundation of other edifices, not less magnificent, which will be equally permanent monuments of their errors. But it is not to be denied that the portraits they have sketched of a republican government were just copies of the originals from which they were taken. If it had been found impracticable to have devised models of a more perfect structure, the enlightened friends of liberty would have been obliged to abandon the cause and the species of government as indefensible. The science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles are now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election, these are wholly new discoveries, or have made their principal progress towards perfection in modern times. They are means, and a powerful means, by which the excellences of republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened or avoided. To this catalogue of circumstances that tend to the amelioration of popular systems of civil government, I shall venture, however novel it may appear to some, to add one more, on a principle which has been made the foundation of an object of the new Constitution. I mean the enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve, either in respect to the dimensions of a single state or to the consolidation of several smaller states into one great confederacy. The latter is that which immediately concerns the object under consideration. It will, however, be of use to examine the principle of its application to a single state, which shall be attended to in another place. The utility of a confederacy, as well as to suppress faction and guard against the internal tranquility of states, as to increase their external force and security, is in reality not a new idea. It has been practiced upon different countries and ages, and has received the sanction of the most approved writers on the subject of politics. The opponents of the plan proposed have, with great assiduity, cited and circulated the observations of Montesquieu on the necessity of contracted territory for a republican government. But they seem to not have been apprised of the sentiments of that great man expressed in another part of his work, nor to have averted the consequences of the principle which they subscribe with such ready acquiescence. When Montesquieu recommends a small extent for republics, the standards he had in view were of the dimensions far short of the limits of almost every one of the states. Neither Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, nor Georgia can by any means be compared with the models from which he reasoned and to which the terms of his description apply. If we therefore take his ideas on this point as the criterion of truth, we shall be driven to the alternative either of taking refuge at once in the arms of a monarchy, or of splitting ourselves into an infinity of little, jealous, clashing, tumultuous commonwealths, the wretched nurseries of unceasing discord, and the miserable objects of universal pity and contempt. Some of the writers who have come forward on the other side of the question seem to have been aware of the dilemma, and have been bold enough to hint at a division of the larger states as a desirable thing. Such an infatuated policy, such a desperate expedient might, by multiplication of petty offices, answer the views of men who possess not qualifications to extend their influence beyond the narrow critiques of personal intrigue, but it could never promote the greatness or happiness of the people of America. Referring the examination of the principle itself to another place, as has already been mentioned, it will be sufficient to remark here that, in the sense of the author who has been most emphatically quoted upon the occasion, it would only dictate a reduction of the size of the more considerable members of the Union, but would not militate against their being all comprehended in one confederate government. And this is the true question, in the discussion of which we are at present interested. So far are the suggestions of Montesquieu from standing in opposition to the general union of states that he explicitly treats of a confederate republic as the expedient for extending the sphere of popular government and reconciling the advantages of monarchy with those of republicanism. It is very probable, says he, that mankind would have obliged at length to live constantly under the government of a single person, had they not contrived the kind of constitution that has all the internal advantages of a republican, together with the external force of a monarchical government. I mean a confederate republic. This form of government is a convention by which several smaller states agree to become members of a larger one, which they intend to form. It is a kind of assemblage of societies that constitute a new one, capable of increasing, by means of new associations, till they arrive to such a degree of power as to be able to provide for the security of a united body. A republic of this kind, able to withstand an external force, may support itself without any internal corruptions. The form of their society prevents all manner of inconveniences. If a single member should attempt to usurp the supreme authority, he could not be supposed to have an equal authority and credit in all of the confederate states. Were he to have too great an influence over one, this would alarm the rest. Were he to subdue a part, that which would still remain free might oppose him with forces independent of those which he had usurped and overpower him before he could be settled in his usurpation. Should a popular insurrection happen in one of the confederate states, the others are able to quell it. Should abuses creep into one part, they are reformed by those that remain sound. The state may be destroyed on one side, and not on the other. The confederacy may be dissolved, and the confederates preserve their sovereignty. As this government is composed of small republics, it enjoys internal happiness of each, and with respect to its external situation, it is possessed, by means of the association, of all of the advantages of large monarchies. I have thought it proper to quote at length these interesting passages, because they contain a luminous abridgment of the principal arguments in favor of the Union, and must effectually remove the false impressions which a misapplication of other parts of the work was calculated to make. They have, at the same time, an intimate connection with the more immediate design of this paper, which is to illustrate the tendency of a Union to repress domestic faction and insurrection. A distinction, more subtle than accurate, has been raised between a confederacy and a consolidation of the states. The essential characteristic of the first is said to be the restriction of its authority to the members in their collective capacities, without reaching to the individuals of whom they are composed. It is contended that a national council ought to have no concern with any object of internal administration. An exact equality of suffrage between the members has also been insisted upon as a leading feature of a confederate government. These positions are, in the main, arbitrary. They are supported neither by the principle or precedent. It has indeed happened that the governments of this kind have generally operated in the manner of which distinction taken notice of supposes to be inherent in their nature. But there have been in most of them extensive exceptions to the practice, which serve to prove, as far as example will go, that there is no absolute rule on the subject, and it will be clearly shown in the course of this investigation that as far as the principle contended for has prevailed, it has been the cause of incurable disorder and imbecility in the government. The definition of a confederate republic seems to simply be an assemblage of societies, or an association of two or more states into one state. The extent, modifications, and objects of the federal authority are mere matters of discretion, so long as the separate organization of the members be not abolished. So long as it exists, by constitutional necessity, for local purposes. Though it should be in perfect subordination to the general authority of the Union, it would still be, in fact and in theory, an association of states or a confederacy. The proposed constitution, so far from implying an abolition of state governments, makes them a constituent part of the national sovereignty by allowing them a direct representation into the Senate, and leaves in their possession certain exclusive and very important portions of sovereign power. This fully corresponds in every rational import to the terms with the idea of a federal government. In the Lycian Confederacy, which consisted of 23 cities or republics, the largest were entitled to 3 votes in the Common Council, those of the middle class to 2, and the smallest to 1. The Common Council had the appointment of all the judges and magistrates from their respective cities. This was certainly the most delicate species of interference in their internal administration, for if there be anything that seems exclusively appropriated by the local jurisdictions, it is the appointment of their own officers. Yet Montesquieu, speaking of this association, says, "Were I to give a model of an excellent confederate republic, it would be that of Lycia." Thus we perceive that the distinctions insisted upon were not within the contemplation of this enlightened citizen, and we should be led to conclude that they are the novel refinements of an erroneous theory. Publius. Paragraph 1. Analysis. Hamilton notes that we have plenty of historical models and lessons hard learned to look back on in order to forge a better union looking forward. He notes that we saw what happened in ancient times past, looking at the republics of Greece and Italy. He notes that they had a lot of problems, and were often teetering between authoritarian extremes and chaotic, unfocused extremes. We have similar, more modern models, which show this to be true. How many European and South American republics seem to swing between hard left and hard right extremes, rather than nestling in the middle, where both extremes are held in check by the other, so the government does not stray too far in one or another direction. He notes that when the ancient republics worked, they were really something special to behold. But these were the exceptions, as whenever they'd work, something would throw off that balance and throw it into one extreme or the other, and the movement to extremity was the norm, while the balance was the rare exception. That due to internal conflicts, the ancient republics were unstable. Paragraph 2, analysis. Because those ancient republics would teeter back and forth, it has caused some historians, even up to Hamilton's day and age, to say republican government doesn't work and is unnatural. And it's better to live in an authoritarian government ran by a monarchy or oligarchy, because those systems are more stable and more in line with human nature. Hamilton rejects this and says that it is a good thing for mankind that others, like Hamilton and his allies, won't give up on liberty because they will make it work by finding a way to keep that balance, and notes that the monarchical or oligarchical advocates are sophists who don't know what they're talking about. Paragraph 3. Hamilton notes that there are many examples in history where republics worked, and that the debate as to whether rule by the people is a good and just thing is as old as republics itself. That since people keep trying to make them work through history, and sometimes do, makes it worth continuing to default to liberty via good republican government. That if it didn't work, people who want liberty and freedom would have all abandoned republican governments long ago. He notes that as the science or knowledge of almost everything has improved greatly since the days of the ancients, so too has political science. That you can keep the troublesome aspects of government in check by melding and amalgamating the parts that did work in the past, such as a legislature to hold in check the executive, and a system of courts to keep both in check, as long as the judges appointed to those courts operate in good behavior. Which incidentally is a problem we in the US right now, in 2018, are having a problem with, because many federal judges are legislating from the bench rather than interpreting the legality of already existing laws in line with the supreme legal document in the body of the Constitution. But that analysis is more apt towards later Federalist Papers, so I will delay that rant until then. As a system of checks and balances that hold each accountable, and pit one another against each other, so they're too busy to repress the rights of individual citizens. Hamilton also talks about increasing the scale of that government, to argue that a federal, constitutional republic, like the one Hamilton and all were trying to get the state legislatures to ratify, was necessary to hold the whole thing together. Paragraph 4. Staying on the point that this debate is nothing new, he notes that some people in the states opposed to federalizing the states under a constitution have been citing one such thinker, the great Montesquieu, who a few generations past delineated on the separation of powers among other philosophical and legal ideas to give many of the founders their specific legal and philosophical justifications for revolting and creating a new union to begin with. These naysayers, Hamilton cites but never names, were quoting Montesquieu in order to say that the US should not be confederated, and should remain small populations each governed as though they were their own small republics, somewhat akin to ancient city-states and tracts of land each controlled and operated within. Hamilton, Jay, and later Madison began writing these Federalist Papers in a direct response to the naysayers, and seems to take great offense to these people using Montesquieu to buttress their arguments, because they left out other things that the French philosopher and legalist said which directly contradict their general argument. Paragraph 5. Hamilton notes that the kinds of republics Montesquieu advocated were not possible in the US, because many states were already larger in scope and scale than he recommended. Hamilton likewise chides the naysayers in saying that the larger states should be further broken up to accommodate this line of argumentation, which Hamilton says is unnecessary, and will backfire when internal strife takes these fragmented municipalities and falls into the pits of despotism as a result, as noted in the previous Federalist paper in regards to internal conflicts and border disputes. He said that the people advocating a split and division were not doing so because they understood Montesquieu's arguments, but were doing it for their own personal gain and intrigue, rather than the benefit of the people at large, and the state specifically. Paragraph 6. Hamilton argues that even if you did take the naysayers' arguments to be in line with Montesquieu's philosophy and edicts, nothing about either precludes a larger confederation of those states and municipalities from existing and from being successful and necessary for their continued peace and prosperity. That their argument against the federated constitution doesn't make sense, because what they were really arguing for is smaller states, which could just as easily become part of the federal republic as the larger states could, so the whole thing is moot and doesn't even get at the real meat of the issue. Paragraph 7. Hamilton continues to expand upon the idea that the naysayers' arguments, buttressed by a misreading and obfuscation of Montesquieu, is not a cogent argument, is not against uniting into a union of states from any specific principle. He then quotes Montesquieu at length to demonstrate this, and present a rejection of the naysayers' arguments. Paragraph 8. Hamilton quotes Montesquieu directly, noting that the French philosopher pointed out that mankind would perpetually be under the thrall of one man, in varying times and places, in the form of kingdoms and empires, were it not for the superior and more liberty-inducing nature of confederate republics. Paragraph 9 and 10. Another quote defining the nature of republics and how they become strong enough to fight off internal and external threats by working together to form new associations by uniting as one. Paragraphs 11, 12, and 13. how the other members of the Union could keep ambitious single members in check and buttress against the abuses from one to the many. That the very nature of a union of smaller unions of people would prevent despotism, and give all involved the necessary power and will to stop those who became so ambitious as to try to take over the rest, or apply more power upon the rest than would be justified and tolerable. That could prevent tyranny before a tyrant could take power, because each state in the Union would have their own specific interests in mind, which would give them an incentive to stop the loss of their own specific sovereignty. And should any state collapse, the rest would retain their sovereignty and survive the fall intact. Paragraph 14. Hamilton says that he quoted the above to show the naysayers and rest of the people reading that Montesquieu was being misquoted, and was in general strongly advocating for a confederation of smaller republics into a larger union. Also, that doing so would go a long way to prevent the internal conflict and insurrection that was common to ancient republics, in order to avoid the problems those ancients would find themselves in as a result of said domestic factions leading to despotism and other extremes. Paragraph 15. To further argue his assertion against the naysayers' points, Hamilton notes that a false dichotomy arising from a confederacy of states opposed to a consolidation of states, which the naysayers created, is not applicable because the naysayers assume that you can only have one or the other, while Hamilton notes that there are exceptions numerous with both potential systems, that you can't generate a concrete rule as to how they will operate. He likewise notes that the aim is to benefit the individual people in all the Union and states by removing the tendency of autocratic defaults, which is a consequence of all governments as a function of time, will be better served by ignoring these inaccurate dichotomies because the opposing viewpoints in the members of states will prevent any one tyrannical state or person from going too far into one of the above-mentioned extremities. He once again defines what a confederate republic is, in the simplest of terms, and notes that the arguments which say that the Constitution and Union will subordinate the states to the point that none of the individual states' problems will be available for redress is nonsense, and that by its design, the Constitution will include the state governments via the Senate to give them just as much say and opportunity to address grievances as the feds themselves will have. That the states will be represented in the Senate and thus have as much say in the workings of the federal government as directly as possible. Something to note about this is that it is no longer the case, with the adoption of the 17th Amendment in 1914, which removed the state legislature's ability to directly interface with the federal government, because that amendment took away the state legislature's power to elect members to the Senate, and it replaced it with a popular vote in each state. This was a huge mistake and flies directly into the face of what Hamilton and the other Federalists wanted. The House of Representatives was supposed to be the body of the people, and the Senate the body of the states, so each would be represented, and would be at odds with one another instead of allowing the feds to be at odds with the individual states. The 17th Amendment was a grave mistake, and is at the heart of many of the problems we now find ourselves in regards to overwhelming federal power, because people did not take Hamilton's advice to heart. Paragraph 17. Hamilton ends the paper noting that even great men like Montesquieu can get it wrong, by pointing out that Lycia was a model of an excellent Confederate republic, because they did not allow universal suffrage or voting rights equally among its members. Some city-states in the Republic of Lycia were more equal than others, because they had more votes and thus more sway than did the others. This mistake would not be repeated by the adoption of the Constitution, which through the Senate would give equal suffrage to each state legislature and make the whole damn thing more fair and philosophically equitable, which again the 17th Amendment simply pissed away 126 years later. General analysis. Hamilton wanted to argue that a union would prevent most of the problems that plague the ancient republics. By taking Montesquieu's arguments for a separation of powers, gained from Machiavelli's point hundreds of years earlier that you need three forms of government rolled into one, a legislative, executive, and judicial, in order to keep each power in check so they can't overstep their boundaries and fall into the despotism and chaos we see in the ancient world, and refuting the naysayers who are misquoting Montesquieu to argue against a union and constitution. To prevent the perpetual distractions, revolutions, and insurrections that plague the ancients, and as a demonstration of the progress of political science had made since then, the United States of America needed to form a federal constitutional republic, which, by the very nature of its existence, would suppress the causes of those ancient problems. Because it was the only thing that would hold the whole damn thing together and stop the circle of usurpation that the naysayers did not seem to understand was a consequence of their arguments and philosophy. The Federalists, of course, did prevail, with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1789, and later adoption of the Bill of Rights as a compromise with the anti-federalists to quell their concerns about the ability of the federal union to abuse its power. It's a damn shame later generations of Americans did not understand Hamilton's arguments, and began the slow process of disassembling the Union, and the carefully crafted balance of powers via the amendment process, which puts us as a nation closer to the tumultuous and precarious predicament those ancient republics created for themselves too, and which ended all of them in time as their internal strife and lack of checks and balances gave way to the autocratic nature of government. Let us hope, then, that the citizens of the United States look back on these arguments made by the founders, so we can get back on the right track and live once again in a nation by, for, and of the people, instead of falling by the wayside as history shows us all other republics have done when they let the governments have too much power with no good check against it.